All right, we're recording. Um, the word Baroque has a lot of different meanings, and I know when we study art history, getting our mind around these various isms is difficult. And part of the reason that it is difficult is that as scholars, we want to nail things down and be real specific. But when we're looking at these genres and periods of cultural history, of course, it's much more complicated than that. So the word Baroque, I mean, in our contemporary use of the word, Baroque might mean something that's has a very busy kind of texture, a lot of stuff going on in it. Um, Another modern use of the word Baroque might be someone's Baroque period would be sort of after they've established themselves and then now they're working as a mature artist. Maybe that might be a sense of Baroque. Or more pejoratively, Baroque might be a sort of self-parodic later phase. In terms of history itself, Baroque, as referring to the 17th century, the 1600s, has a lot to do, for example, with the rise of nation states. We're going to look at painting today, and we're going to see how this flourishing of the economy in parts of sectors of the population in the 17th century led to some amazing artwork. So, but when we talk about Baroque painting, there's a particular sense of the Baroque. I mean, there's that larger sense of the 17th century, it's the rise of power, Louis XIV, Versailles, and all of that. I'm going to slight that political history a bit this time around in favor of doing some more art history. But but the painting very much reflects that. So we're going to look at that when we look at both the southern and the northern Baroque. Today we're going to look at the northern Baroque, and it's a very sumptuous Baroque. So let's get started on northern Baroque painting. Some very, very beautiful painting indeed. We're going to share the screen here. Well, you were in full screen mode. I really need that. Okay. Here right. Okay. So we had Baroque painting. The first Baroque painting, we looked at Caravaggio and Velasquez. Now we're going to look at Rembrandt and Vermeer. One of the things that I didn't talk about as much in the Baroque Painting 1 video was how many other artists there are in this milieu, the North, Holland, um, the Netherlands. You get a lot of merchants, a lot of people with new money to spend. And you also, this is, remember now, 100 years into the Protestant Reformation, and you also have really different kinds of attitudes towards the sort of individual in the culture. But I do want to start um, the northern Baroque today by looking at some other painters first, because there's really some very extraordinary decorative stuff going on. So I want to talk about still life painting. This became a very, very refined market. In fact, there were specific artists who would do, say, flowers, artists who would do uh, pictures of wildlife and so on. They'd be that specialized. And some of these artists are really quite amazing. As I said, on that first bullet point, you have middle class wealth. So you have a large market for these smaller paintings now. Pronkstillavens, opulent still lifes. The still life was a way to show a person's technical expertise, but there was a great demand for these works just as such. And so you get, again, that technical command. These are virtuosic pieces of art. And they are also, this is also art that's expressing a lot of, this is a society that's pretty comfortable with itself in the 17th century. Holland is powerful. Holland has prevailed in the War of Spanish Succession. It has it has an empire, it has a mighty navy, and in particular, it has a thriving economy, and it is a secular economy. The church is very important in this society, but it doesn't have some of the formal power that we see in the South. Uh, So one way that's expressed is in this celebration of the opulence of the ordinary bourgeois person, these magnificent sort of still lifes of meals, some eaten, some ready to be eaten. The other side of that, and is also a very Protestant kind of thing, where the sort of vanitas, you've seen these paintings before. They typically include skulls and other images of death. They were full of all sorts of imagery. I think we'll probably see in one or two of the paintings the peeled lemon, the fruit that looks sweet but is actually sour, and that kind of thing. So some of the fun of these paintings then was interpreting what some of the objects meant symbolically. So as I said, then opulent and unself-conscious enjoyment of wealth, but very self-conscious piety at the same time, a very sort of Protestant combination. So let's just look at a few of these people. I'm not going to give details. I'm just going to give you the names of the artists. And I'm not going to try to pronounce all these 17th century Dutch names either. I'll give them a shot. Again, some people specialized in paintings of flowers, Beijeren. And so notice something else. We were looking at Caravaggio, and in a minute or two here, we're going to start to look at Rembrandt. What's that all about? Chiaroscuro. And notice that these people are masters of that. Look at that brass object, the brass receptacle next to the coffee pot, next to the teapot. Oh, by the way, and in the teapot, and you can see it here in the reproduction, you will notice you can see the artist. The artist is reflected in the teapot. There's also always a glass with liquid in it. There's some very exquisite chiaroscuro paintings of light shining on wine glasses. But the technical virtuosity of it is quite amazing. Peter Claes, and here we see we see a meal that's already been consumed. Again, you have the glass of wine, wonderful details, these oysters, and they will sort of keep adding on. And then you see there also the parrot. Remember, you've got the Dutch West Indies, you have the Dutch tropical empire, and out in Indonesia, the Dutch are in the Caribbean. And so you also have objects here and fruit that is stuff that's been imported from the Dutch Empire, musical instruments playing also always an important role in these paintings. So there are these wonderful Dutch genre paintings, still lifes, as well as the portraiture. I think you might have already noticed that if you're interested in some of these artists, you tend to start to see a lot of portraiture, which is an interesting genre, but the still life genre is now really taken off. Again, you're thinking about the things we were talking about coming out of the Renaissance. Now the artist is really free, and now you see the artist having much more of a kind of socio-cultural role. And these are, of course, luxury consumer goods that we're looking at here. Consumer goods, not like those paintings painted for nobility for their palaces. And above all, that use of light and darkness that's so characteristic of Baroque painting. Okay, so let's look at then the most famous of all of these painters. That's Rembrandt. Rembrandt, incredibly prolific painter. Rembrandt, who really brings Caravaggio, the chiaroscuro technique pioneered by Caravaggio, to the north, and it really becomes, as you saw in those genre paintings, really ubiquitous. Rembrandt does drawings, paintings, and etchings. He's a master engraver. I think his paintings and his drawings, you see a lot of Rembrandt's drawings around. I think his paintings are so famous that people don't realize how many etchings he has. Over 300, there's about 2,000 drawings. We have around 600 paintings, almost 100 self-portraits, and we're going to look at the self-portraits after we look at a couple of the other famous paintings. Again, stressing now this difference between the North and the South. Why stress the difference between the North and the South? Well, if you're me, the reason to stress the difference between the North and the South is because it helps me understand some differences that I'm seeing when I'm looking at the paintings. That's kind of pretty much it. But then notice that as students, what you need to see is that now we're 100 years after the Protestant Reformation. You've got that Counter-Reformation movement in the Latin countries to the south. And so now we can make that connection, a pretty deep connection between these changes, these cultural and institutional changes, and some of the changes that we're seeing in the art. Because that's what it's all about. It's all about being able to bring the historical context, technology, political history, and all kinds of other things to bear on seeing the art, and the art also then is a tool to interpret other things as well. Of course, under Catholic doctrine in the 17th century, you wanted the soul the body couldn't be damaged before it was buried. That was the idea. So it was um, very northern thing to be doing these public dissections, which they did, and then that also reflects this interest in the new natural science, which was, of course, also something that was more liberal in the North than it was in the Latin countries. And similarly then with the Night Guard. The Night Guard is probably his most famous painting. It's a very large painting. And what we have here is a very secular painting. These different guard groups, they're actually mostly ceremonial. These were worthies of the town. They weren't necessarily running around actually putting out fires and stuff like that. But they were civic groups, and these paintings were expressions of civic pride for the city. So the anatomy lesson. Now, another thing about this, people ask, well, who are these people? These people are all identified, and much is known about them. These people all paid to be in these paintings. People would pay Rembrandt to be in the painting. And the idea was, well, okay, you're one of the sort of upper class intellectuals around the city, Utrecht. And then you might be one of the people who's approached. Not just anybody could be in the painting. But then you were one of the people who might be there, but then you were added into the painting. In fact, that one figure, that sort of more ghostly figure on the way to the left, is painted on later. So someone paid Rembrandt later on, after he'd made the painting, to paint that person in. And all these paintings that you see are like that. The characters, the people in the paintings, the night watch is like that. That is, these are all people actually paid. And in fact, the rate that it would cost for you to be in the painting would vary depending on how prominently placed you were in the painting. Rembrandt might charge you more. And this was a common thing. Again, very much this sort of bourgeois now consumerism that's characterizing this wealthy mercantile trading culture of the Protestant Dutch. This is just one of my personal favorites of Rembrandt, but Rembrandt does a lot of very lined older faces. He's very good at evoking age, and some critics thought, gosh, some people would say about Rembrandt, he just doesn't care about beauty at all. In a sense, I think we see that about a lot of these great artists. They're very far beyond any kind of cornball kind of conception of what art is. And of course, here you also see that deep, deep use of black chiaroscuro. The Night Watch, in fact, was called the Night Watch. Here it is. The Night Watch was called the Night Watch before it was cleaned, because it had gotten so dirty that people just thought it was taking place at night. It's not actually something that's taking place at night. And again, it's not actually a real watch, but it's a lot of the sort of upper class merchants or wealthy merchants of the city who have commissioned him to make this painting. Again, a very large painting. The woman in gold is there, coming out as kind of a symbolic symbol of the whole city, apparently. And these people, again, would march in parades and so on. The Night Watch. Now, the other thing about Rembrandt is all those self-portraits. I mentioned he has almost 90 self-portraits. So it's quite incredible, because we can look at him as he ages all through his life. Here he is in the year 1630. And here he is 10 years later in the year 1640, obviously doing very well. Another thing, though, that Rembrandt liked to do was to paint himself dressed up like various kinds of historical figures and soldiers and things. So we have some fairly, there's humor in Rembrandt. Humor, Rembrandt is often sort of arch and sees the humor in things. 1652, almost 10 years later, almost exactly 10 years later. And here he is in 1660. Again, he's doing very well. He's got a nice big black silk hat. This is painted on the year of his death. He has a number of paintings that he did of himself on the year of his death. And again, we have charcoal drawings. We have all kinds of self-portraits by Rembrandt. So that they're very, that's a really very extraordinary thing to look at. Okay, so, and the other one that we're going to look at, then the last thing we're going to do today is to look at Jan Vermeer. Vermeer is a mysterious character. He's very, very distinctive, very unique. You'll see when we look at the paintings now that they really don't look like these other Baroque paintings, which after all are similar to each other. And if you enjoy the paintings for a while, you'll be able to pretty much spot 17th century paintings and various other genres of painting. Some are easier to identify than others. Nothing jumps out like ancient Egyptian stuff. There's nothing else that's like ancient Egyptian stuff at all. Anyway, Vermeer vanished into obscurity after he passed away. People just forgot about him altogether. And then in the 19th century, the 1800s, about 200 years ago, after about 200 years, or 150 years or so after his death, he was rediscovered. We don't know much about him. He belonged to the Painters Guild. He was a member of the Painters Guild. We know he had 11 children, which wasn't unusual for this time, by the way. And we have exactly 35 paintings. Compare that to how much Rembrandt we have, for example. But that's it. That's pretty much what we know about Jan Vermeer. What we have on the paintings, on the canvas, first of all, a master colorist, someone who's, the way he does the color is somehow with the light. It's like with Vermeer, you can sort of see the light hanging in the air in the space in the paintings. We'll take a look at that. And then I want to talk about the camera obscura. He used actually what today is, well, until digital came along, but even film cameras really use the same kind of techniques as Vermeer was using, and I'm going to give you a link to a documentary about that. That's very interesting. First, a couple of his very famous paintings, Girl with a Pearl Earring. Now let's just think about, again, color. This is an old painting. You can see the cracks on the canvas when you look at the light colored surface areas in the painting. But at the same time, look at the way that the color of the painting, including the color of the eyes, jumps out at you. And I said before, there's a sense where it's all about the light shining on the surface and then the darkness in the back. And there's you get that sort of sense of the air in the room. You get a real sense of three-dimensionality. And the Milkmaid, and again, look at those colors. Golds and blues imbuing everything, and everything has to do with the light. Now, the other thing we're noticing here is that she's standing in the corner of a room, and on our left, there's a window and the light's shining in from the window. And then there's a wall in the back that extends off to our right, supposedly where the door into the room and so on are, but we don't see that. So notice that as we look at that painting, the interior, the layout of that room, because now we're going to look at this, the camera obscura. Again, you sort of have almost a room-sized area, and then what these people did in the 17th century was to put a lens in the hole. That is, again, these people are working with technology, and they have lenses, and so you can get a much clearer sort of image from the pinhole of light that you're using, which previously had really been mostly good for looking at the sun itself. And the other images were quite faint, but with lenses, this was able to be refined. Now, of course, we don't, Vermeer didn't come with a guidebook. This had to be figured out and established. Officer and Laughing Girl from 1657. Again, notice you've got the window is in the same place, the wall, but also look at that map on the wall. That's an extremely detailed map of the Low Country. That's a map of Holland and the big areas that they had diked in and so on. And to paint that accurately from the map that you had in front of you, and then you would paint it up. But it makes a lot more sense if you realize that he's just projected that onto that wall, and then he can trace over it from there. Notice anything similar about this room from those other two rooms that we just looked at? Notice there's a mirror. Also, a mirror is always important in Baroque art. Light coming from the same place because it's the same room. The 35 paintings. We have some landscapes. They're actually townscapes of the docks and so on. We have 3 or 4 of those, and we have some of these close-up portraits of young women like the girl with the pearl earring. But for the most part of the 35 paintings that we have, they look like this, with that window on the left, the light coming in there. And again, you see a very, very detailed map on a kind of tapestry hung on the wall in the back there, something that would be very difficult to transfer from your eye, off a surface into your eye, out of your hand, but makes a lot more sense if you realize he's actually using what we would consider some sort of photographic technology. The geographer, and so on. So Vermeer use of color, a very unique painter, and then you've got this camera obscura. So all right, so this video then was about the Northern Baroque, and the 2 Northern Baroque painters that we looked at were Rembrandt and Vermeer. The first video was about Baroque painting, was about the Southern Baroque, and the 2 artists that we looked at were Caravaggio and Velázquez. Remember, there are many, many other artists, all kinds of stuff to look at and all kinds of directions to take this study in. I'm going to put these both up in the same week, and you can choose whichever artists you want to look into and study. That's up to you. So, all right. Very satisfying for me, taking another look at Baroque art. We will continue to look at painting. Next time, we will look at a transition in the next century, the 18th century, from what's called Rococo to what's called neoclassical art. But the art that we've been looking at these last 2 videos, the art of the 17th century, the 1600s, that's Baroque art. Okay, so we went for Baroque. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Okay, bye-bye. Better go.